In the beginning of my curation, Residential School System of Canada, a cultural genocide, I hope to present the traditional way of life of the Aboriginal people, and by the end of the exhibit, I'm hoping that students will see how the Aboriginal way of life was almost wiped out by the Canadian government and start to make comparisons to their own lives. Now, of course, to argue that this is a cultural genocide, I want to first verify that cannot be categorized as a physical genocide. That is, being a mass killing of members of a targeted group, such as seen in the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide. Nor can it be classified as a biological genocide, that is, the destruction of a group's reproductive capacity. Rather, a cultural genocide, as seen in Canadian history through the residential school system, is the destruction of structures and practices that allow a group to continue living as a group. Through the residential schools, in addition to the Indian Act, the Canadian government attempted to remove those political and social structures of the Aboriginal people, seize their land and restrict their movement, and forcibly transfer people from one location to another. The goal of this part of the curation is to present an honest and understanding of the Aboriginal way of life in an outdoor classroom. The space will have 3 images located in it. Through these images, students will see the deep love the Aboriginal people had for their children, as all cultures do. Students will notice how students learn, the way the structure was set up. Students will also see Aboriginal children learning about morals, appropriate behavior, as well as the influence of the Europeans on the Aboriginal life. Now I want you to keep in mind, as with any curation, it should be noted that who I am has influenced the choice of artifacts and photos being included, as well as the overarching design of this particular curation. I am nevertheless attempting to curate this traumatic history in a manner that is honest to the people that suffered and continue to suffer, as well as those who have lost their lives under the authority of the residential school system. I've included Martin's art piece, Sacred Bentwood Box, in an effort to try and bring to the foreground the voices of those who have suffered. As with any exhibition, there are limitations. I think the inability to gauge the student's ability to grapple with the content that's presented is a potential limitation. Students are not all at the same point, intellectually, socially, or socio-emotionally. And students come to learning opportunities with a variety of different experiences. In order to try and address these limitations, there'll be limited signage that will outline the purpose of residential schools, that being to remove Aboriginal youth from the influence of their families. Alongside of this would be the comparison of residential schools to present public schooling system, and the fact that students were forcibly taken to go to a school, and in present day the government still mandates that children must go. Here, of course, what we're trying to get in is this idea of, or this conversation around sovereignty. Who has the right to decide what we learn? And of course, how does that impact us? As another part of the images will be images that are showing or demonstrating how people attempted to speak up for the crimes and the atrocities and the horrors of the residential school system, and the fact that the Canadian government didn't listen, they didn't change, they allowed it to continue. We know in 1907, the medical inspector of Indian Affairs, Dr. Bryce, reported that the residential schools of Canada were a national crime, yet nothing was done. It's not surprising, because the government's policy, which was firmly established in legislation at the time that the treaties had been negotiated, was to assimilate Aboriginal people into the broader Canadian society. At the end of this process, Aboriginal people were expected to have ceased to exist as a distinct people, with their own governments, cultures, or identities. As is the nature with the cultural genocide, The students were taken from their homes, stripped of their belongings, separated from their siblings. Residential school children lived in a world dominated by fear and loneliness and a lack of affection. And through this artifact, students will understand the sorrow and sadness that these students of residential schools experienced. In the third stage of the exhibit, this will be the focal point of my curatorial dream, as my goal is for students to come to terms with our history. In this stage of the exhibition, students will see and hear from former Prime Minister Harper as he apologizes to the Canadians' First Nations people for the abuses of the residential school system. Juxtaposed on the opposite wall in the same space, students will see and hear current Prime Minister Trudeau as he promises to meet the terms that the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation has set forward to build a relationship of respect between two nations, the Aboriginals and Canadians. Through these two videos, I hope to create a sense of where we as Canadians were under Harper's government and where we have come under the guidance of Trudeau. The only signage that will be posted in this area is one question: where will you go now? In the final stage of the exhibit, the goal here will be to underline a key theme that the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation has addressed, and that is whether one is the First Nations, Inuit, Métis, a descendant of European settlers, a member of a minority group that suffered historical discrimination in Canada, or a new Canadian, we all inherit both the benefits and obligations of Canada. We are all treaty people who share responsibility for taking action on reconciliation. Now, this particular quote will then have Justice Murray Sinclair and Amy Kraft for students to talk to, along with a concluding section in which students will be able to reflect and respond and grapple with the exhibition that they've entered and gone through. Thanks.